more today.
Oops. Okay, great. All right, we have a few faces here. That's good. Should we get started?
Atmospheric river, it's like it's a new term this year. And
Yeah,
you've had 13 of them already? Whew.
yeah, this is the 13th though, just the tail end of it today. Yeah.
Okay, there's only one, and that is that they can interrupt with a question,
Mhm.
but before we start, they should mute themselves, right? And
Okay,
then if they have a question, just unmute.
okay.
All right, got it.
If you have a question, you may have heard that from Elizabeth. If you could mute when we start, and if you have a question anytime, just unmute and ask. You won't be interrupting. I'm going to try not to go too fast this evening. And there's lots of images, so feel free to ask about anything, the materials, the artist, the idea, whatever, okay? So we will get started, and I'm not touching anything this time. Great. Good. Good.
And you don't like having.
No, I'll recognize voice if I need. Great, thank you. So do you see it well over there? And can you hear me? No problem? Good. I chose artwork of 5 different artists to talk about this evening. Friends, acquaintances of mine. And I wanted to show a variety, and they're all alive, not necessarily still producing art, but we'll talk about them individually. And before I start, I just wanted to talk a little bit about taste. During COVID, when we were doing the Zooms and I was showing movies and trying to introduce people to different contemporary art forms, we discussed taste, particularly some of the performance art, etc. And we're looking at visual art this evening, drawing and painting. And I just want you to think about it. I'm sure most of you who do art already do think about it. And we have a very immediate response to art. We like it, we don't like it, or we don't even think about it. It doesn't move us. When somebody teaches or writes critiques or thinks about art in different ways, it's a challenge sometimes to get beyond one's taste. And I find if one holds back on liking and disliking and just looks, sometimes it allows us to change our mind. So, well, that's a subject I want to talk about at some point. But we'll maybe pick it up at the end. So we're going to start with a friend, Brian Smith, who lives in Toronto. And he's an artist that I met when I started to teach at Halliburton, the art school in Toronto. And he and his partner, Victoria Cowan, became very good friends of mine. And both of them taught at Halliburton as well. So they're both artists who taught. They are at the moment retired from teaching, but still make art. Brian is interesting. He had an academic training, so a classical training in drawing and painting. His mother was an artist, so it was a natural thing for him to do. He didn't have to fight his way into being an artist. But he did earn his living initially as a graphic artist, designing packaging for commercial products. He's a very sensitive draftsman. He draws beautifully, and he taught at different schools in Ontario. at OCA, the Ontario College of Art, and others. And he's a very comprehensive teacher. He's patient and takes his time and expresses himself well. So I'm starting with the portrait of Sunny. I had the pleasure of meeting Sunny. She's no longer with us. She died a few years ago, but I met her about 10 years ago when she was 95. And she would come to Halliburton Art School, sometimes as a student and sometimes as a model. And she's just one of these unforgettable people who just love life. So when I met her, the first thing she told me was that she had lived on boats most of her life and was currently living on a ship with her 70-year-old partner, a younger man. So, and she was just amazing. She dressed with beautifully, I mean, she was just a beautiful woman. So this, you can see Brian is very sensitive in his representations. He works a lot with any material, really. He paints and draws. I don't think he uses oil. He's primarily a draftsman here with charcoal on toned paper. And he works a lot when he paints in acrylic. I sort of threw in this, I think I wrote it actually, but who knows. It's interesting that we have 900 years of art history starting in the caves, and it's a lot. Brian took some of my classes at Halliburton. As teachers, we could take each other's classes, which was a privilege. Mostly, we don't have that opportunity. And one of the things that he wanted to do was loosen up on his academic representation. And it's very hard when you've had a very classical training. It's hard to break out of it. You know, the habits, the visual habits, they take us by the neck the same way that cigarettes can. We become addicted to a way of working. On the right is a painting in acrylic. He managed to incorporate an imaginary element into his work. And even though it's painted in a highly realistic classical way, he's able to make a comment about his influences, his mother, his wife, and he has another painting where I'm in there somewhere. I couldn't find it, but it's beautifully done. He really has a highly sensitive touch to his work. He also did a whole series of self-portraits, quite courageous for a plump fellow. I thought he was, you don't always see a lot of artists who are willing to examine themselves. This is a more recent image during COVID. I think he grew the beard like a lot of people. And on the right, influenced by his wife, who's a printmaker, he made a lino cut. Lino cut is carving into linoleum, planning it so that you get part of the drawing represented on paper. For instance, the light part, the lightest part might have been carved out first, then a continuation of the carving, perhaps to get the stripy area on the right. And then the last part would be to dig around the dark areas. In any event, it's done in a few stages, but it's a very interesting and it's a printmaking form that one can do without a press. It's something you can do with pressure. Brian has done many different kinds of drawings. Some of them I like more than others, but he did a series of figure studies of hybrids where he put imaginary heads on some of his models. And I found them really beautiful. I liked his choice of the particular animal or whatever he was adding to the human body and the pose that his model was taking. And all done with a very, very sensitive hand, a really good knowledge of anatomy and playing with light and dark values. He generally doesn't work from photographs. He works live with models. And I understand that because it's very exciting. Here's some other ones. So there's I don't know how many he made. There may have been 10 or 12 of them. And they all have that same quality of sensitivity to the touch. He works with all kinds of models. This is Murray McKay, who came to Montreal for a couple of years. I loved working with him. He's an exceptionally skinny model, very, very thin, and but he has a very solid presence to him. And Brian simplifies when he paints. You can see the flat quality of the painting on the right, and the fact that he simplified his colors. So that makes his decision-making when he's painting a little bit easier, a limited palette. Here we have light and dark, just grayscale. But again, beautiful sensitivity to the face. He has a good sense of design, being a graphic artist who designed packaging, etc. His sense of placement, the forms, the movement, the energy. I'm going back to some of the things that we did the first few weeks, which had to do with composition and light and dark, and some of the very basic concerns. We were talking about vocabulary and sharing a common language when we look at art. Here again, limited palette, but a really good sensitivity to the light and dark values. Brian's desire to get away from classical drawing led him to different experimentations. Some were successful, some weren't. One of the difficulties that I see in this, and he pulls together a beautiful image, is that he sticks very closely to classical and realistic anatomy, and at the same time is wanting to break out in color. And that is not easy to do. Generally, there are struggles between form, the formal elements, and the expressive color. If you think of the Northern European expressionists in the 1800s, early 19th, they allowed the form to change as much as their treatment of color and the way it was interpreted. It's an interesting dilemma that can be discussed at some point. Where he allows the forms to become flatter, less shadow, less realism, where the paint can bite into the form. I think he's a bit more successful. But you can see how he's really exploring alternate ways of expressing the figure true to the anatomy and the feel of the model, but with a much looser expressive type of brushwork and freedom of color. And some of them, again, because he has worked with color and form for so long, he succeeds where other artists would be still struggling with the looser interpretation of the human figure. Sometimes he's more realistic with little venturing into less realistic treatment. Sometimes he really allows the figure, the anatomy of the figure to break down. In this one, the figure really seems to work in the world of the energy and shapes around it. It's the chair that seems to be solidly stuck in a realistic representation. Purposeful, I have no doubt. Whether it's successful or not, I'm not sure. And he and I spent many hours talking and arguing and agreeing and disagreeing on the type of work that an artist can do today with the 900 years of art history behind them. So that's an ongoing conversation. Oh, yes, I have some blank, whoops, ooh, we don't want that. I've got blank black slides in between the artists. I consider it like palette cleansing when you're going through a meal with many different servings, because it's hard sometimes to jump from one artist to another. Kay is a friend of mine, a long-term friend. She's now in her mid-80s. We met in the 1970s at Powerhouse Gallery, and we've studied together. We both spent time at the Vermont Studio School. We've shared studios, we shared many things, and Kay has often taught with me in the Beauce and in Charlevoix when I had my summer school. He was consistently teaching nature studies and introducing beginners to drawing and painting. When I met Kay, she was in her 40s. She had raised 2 boys, she and her husband, and then discovered she was pregnant with the 3rd child, Jessie. And it was a bit of a shock to her because she thought all that was over and the kids were beginning to be independent. And here was a baby on the way and a little child and somebody who was a bit of a surprise. So she was a photographer and she had studied painting and printmaking. And as she had done with the 2 boys, she did again when Jessie was born. He made the family her subject matter, which allowed her to make her art and raise her kids. Many women have this dilemma, how to maintain their art and raise their family at the same time. So this is a drawing. She did very large drawings. She began painting again by using dry graphic pencil and charcoals, layering, building up a surface. And this is observed and imaginary sword game that her kid was playing. This is another quotation that I thought was relevant by Barbara Hepworth, the British sculptress, and it is about seeing and feeling. I'll just give you a minute to read that. Very often when artists are talking, they use the word feel. And I think it's because there's an integration between the senses and the intelligence that happens in art that is often separate in life. I felt it strongly when I taught for a block of time at McGill, and I was meeting a lot of people from the science faculty. The intelligence and thinking seemed to be in the upper part of their body rather than something that was integrated throughout. It's again, a whole other discussion and a huge topic, and that is art and intelligence, not to be discussed this evening in too much detail. These are very large drawings that she would sometimes do on paper, sometimes on wood, sometimes pieced together. She works at home in a very small, well, it's a room, and it's very small. And piecing the work together is actually probably a necessity for her, but she makes it work. So these could easily be 4 or 5 foot high by 2 or 3 feet wide. I didn't take all the titles and the details about the work. I wanted people to look, to use their eyes, but Kay uses very basic art materials, primarily ones that continue to move, that aren't too resistant to water. So very often chalks, charcoals, water-based stuff, gouache rather than acrylic, though she might add acrylic to it. The gouache, which is opaque watercolor, dries on a surface, but can then move around. You can rub it and move it. So it has a flexibility that acrylic, which tends to dry in a more plastic layer, doesn't have. It's a very old medium. These are 3 panels. Both of us
Joanna,
enjoy long. Whoop. Hello, yeah,
I have a question. What you were just describing, you were describing gouache?
yes.
Gouache word, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Do you know it? Gouache?
Yeah, I
G-
do. Yeah, but I
Yes.
find it interesting that you clarify that difference between the acrylic and the, the plastic.
Yes.
The acrylic
Gouache,
and the movement gouache.
Yeah. If you add acrylic medium to gouache paint, it
Mhm.
takes on some of the characteristics of acrylic and becomes more water resistant.
Uh-huh.
But on its own, when it's layered and used without acrylic, it has that capacity to move, to be changed, to be wiped off, to be layered and added on.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, thanks. I haven't,
Here, yes,
I haven't played with gouache for a long time, but it's motivating
well,
to hear about it. Yeah.
It's still available. You've got many qualities. I use it a lot, and it can function on its own or as an underpainting for acrylic and oil. And it's been around for hundreds of years. It's a very solid medium, and we can talk about it later on if you like. It's just it's quite wonderful. I enjoy it very much. Kay is also a landscape painter. We both, when we were teaching in Charlevoix and in the Beauce, would go out with students and work on the spot outdoors. You get a feel for the gouache, particularly here. I hope you can see the cursor. I think you can. Do you see the cursor? Yeah, you must see it on the screen. When you put very thin layers of gouache over light gouache, over darker colors, you get a kind of smoky overlayer that softens what goes on underneath. So some of this yellowish color might soften what otherwise might be too much of a harsh differentiating between the dark mountains and the sky. So the thin layers of gouache, we could call them semi-transparent. And Kay uses it. It changes color a little bit, and it softens and makes less of a hard edge where you want to have more blending. At some point, Kay was flying to France. Her daughter lives there. And she did sketches, very quick sketches, not in color, but looking down from the airplane window at clouds and at some landscape elements that she saw, which kind of looked like a river running through it. I'm not sure, but they're beautiful paintings with a lot of movement. She has a beautiful fluidity to her work. Here's another one, particular 3 or 4 clouds with the landscape underneath. This one, I believe, is oil paint. The texture feels different and just, it's hard to tell. We talked about this briefly a couple of weeks ago at one of the other presentations. I find it unfortunate that artwork is viewed primarily on the internet. It has advantages and disadvantages. The image comes across beautifully, but when you don't see a painting in front of you, the subtleties of the touch, of the feel, of how the paint moves and how it's been manipulated gets lost. But here again, it's a very loosely rendered landscape. Whoops. Here's another one. And Kay experiments a lot with the colors of her ground, meaning the surface, the paper or wood that she works on. The gouache allows her the transparency. This one is not oil, it's a flatter painting, so I think it's done in gouache. Maybe had ink under it. Once again, all the materials, all drawing materials, dry and wet, are compatible. And then they can be compatible with acrylic. Once you start to add oil, you need to have a little bit more attention to the layering so that your oil layers are not put on too early. And also, you don't want to apply a layer onto something else and have it not adhere. Acrylic on top of oil is going to flake off. This is very basic, and certain layering techniques, you have to know a little bit of paint chemistry. But if you're not working in oil, almost everything is compatible, as long as the acrylic isn't used too thick and too heavy. Then it creates a kind of plastic layer that is very hard to work with on top of it or to incorporate other materials. It's possible, but it has to be done carefully. So there is a bit of chemistry that needs to be explored or known. Kay and I both had this funny material. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was an extremely smooth synthetic paper. And depending on the surface, which it can be absorbent or non-absorbent, you can experiment. And the more experience you have in experimentation, you can get different effects. So this was an experiment of applying paint and texture to this highly, highly glossy, smooth surface. I don't know if Kay continued with it, perhaps. The series
Joanna?
of works that, yes,
Was
yeah.
was that Mylar?
No,
No.
I'm trying to go backwards here. Whoops, I'm going forward. This side? Whoa, magic, no. One sec, this might be backwards. Nope.
Here, hang on.
I think I got it. Okay, so I'm gonna, thank you, Elizabeth. It's not Mylar, although it probably gives a similar effect. It's a heavier coated synthetic paper and it's white. I can look up the name. Is that Debbie asking the question? I'm not sure. It's available.
Yes, it
readily in
was.
the art supplies. Yeah, it's not Mylar, but it would work like uncoated Mylar. It doesn't have a lot of grip to it. And the way you would use your material, if you use very diluted paint, because it's so glossy and doesn't absorb, you might get too many puddles. So this would appear to be a thicker use of paint, possibly gouache, but my guess is that it's acrylic, which is a synthetic paint and would stick to the mylar more carefully.
Yeah, I tried
Um,
that paper a couple years ago.
Yes.
I didn't like it. It was too slippery.
You know, what you use is very tactile, and everybody develop, well, not everybody, but artists of experience know by the feel of something, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
And sometimes pushing through the dislike can reveal some wonderful effects. So experimentation shouldn't stop. It's something that should be ongoing in our work. And if it's chemically, if it's going to hold together, then it's fine. That would be the only thing, is you don't want the thing to disintegrate or to have layers fall off. But this is also a philosophical discussion, because there are artists whose art is based on work disintegrating over a period of time. And other people would argue that the future is less important to art. The longevity of art is less important today. Museums are full of art and not collecting that much. Is it important that the piece maintains itself over centuries? So lots of questions going on in art today about subjects that would have been taken for granted years ago. Yes, you want artwork to last, or you need a good reason if you want to show people how it disintegrates. Where are we? Okay, here we are at Kay's Interiors. Kay had, she's had a very, very small studio for many years. And when she had opportunities to work in big empty spaces, she liked it. She had access to an industrial building at one time that she could put up her studio in there. And she worked with the empty space in a beautiful way. It was just empty industrial space. And this is where observation and imagination come in. She could work with the architectural structure and with light and color, and created this whole world of life and history alive in what might just have looked like solid, dead architecture to anyone else. These are large. One of the difficulties with size is what do you do with it? They were about, I saw some of them, they were 5 or 6 feet high, on heavy paper mounted on wood. And they were using dry chalks and gouache, so dry and wet media on top. Here are 3 others. Gives you an idea of the different qualities of interpretation that she did. It's as if she infused a kind of spirit life into this architecture. They're very impressive pieces. They were beautiful. Here's another one, the metal beams, the wooden floors, the light, or use of light and dark. And these textures, these wonderful textures that she evoked out of very basic and simple material. Yeah, it's really an invitation to look into the painting, particularly the transparency, these I mean, this one really feels like it's alive with some spirits, an empty space, and it provokes a lot of emotion, really, within what might have been a very cold perspective otherwise. And I want you to think about this, we'll come back to this, when we look at some of the interiors of Michael Merrill, another artist interpreting space and structure. So this is really, well, this is a particularly beautiful one, also very big. So this is the palette cleansing. So cleanse your eyes. And we're going on to a friend of mine from the Beauce region, Yolande Bernier. I met Yolande when I started my adult summer school in the Beauce region about 1987. Come in, please join us. So in 19, no, it wasn't 1987, it was about 1980. And I had access to a beautiful studio and started this summer school for adults. People came for 1 week at a time. I hired teachers. And at one of our introductory sessions, Yolande Bernier, who was a local artist, came, introduced herself, and we've been friends ever since. Yolande was very interested in things Asian. And while she was living in the Beauce and raising 2 daughters alone, she managed to arrange 2 study sessions in Japan at the University of Tokyo to learn a very old Japanese painting technique called Nihonga, N-H-O-N-G-A, if my Japanese spelling is correct. And it's an old technique. The Japanese never developed oil painting. They worked from inks and colored inks towards resin painting, resin coming from trees, like a varnish, like maple syrup, I guess. And they would create these beautiful layerings on paper mounted on wood. It's very old technique. They incorporated silver leaf and gold leaf. That is extremely thin hammered layers of gold and silver. Today, aluminum, copper, a variety of metals. Very hard to manipulate, that are glued and sunken into the resin layers. When I met Yolande, she was getting ready for her first trip to Japan, and she asked me after the summer of teaching whether I would house sit her little farmhouse while she was gone. She was gone for 8 months. Her sister, who had about 5 kids, incorporated Yolande's children into the gang, and everybody seemed happy. And she learned over the years in 4 subsequent trips, she got more and more knowledge of this very, very old Japanese technique. And the work is quite remarkable. When she started her studies in painting, she was a realistic painter and did a lot of florals and nature and recognizable imagery. And when she started to incorporate the Japanese painting technique, her Quebec floral imagery began to work into the paintings. Here's another, sometimes I find non-painters say wonderful things about art or things that apply to art. And here's a little statement about Solzhenitsyn that appealed to me. This is a very large horizontal work, probably done within the last 10 years. You can see Yolande still has the beautiful floral elements. These squares are of one of the leaves of metal. I don't know which one. It's hard to see it in the image, but it could be the silver, the application of silver, which can be painted on. So the Nahonga technique goes into this resin painting. She sticks to the traditional methods, but her imagery is taking it and making it hers, more personal. Here again, she's worked in Quebec imagery. Here it's more interpreted, always meticulously put together, very beautifully mounted rice paper. It's called rice paper. It's not, it doesn't come from rice. It comes from the mulberry trees. And it's that very absorbent paper that some of you might have seen in Asian art. She needs to block the transparency. So there's layers of a certain consistency of resin. Then she takes the Japanese ground mineral colors, mixes them with heated resin, and begins to apply these thin, beautiful layers. There is a relationship visual to the gouache paintings that we saw before, and they create great depth in the surface. Here's another one with, you can begin to get a feel for some of the metallic stuff in there. But because it's an image on the internet, it's a little hard to see it. These are later works, which still incorporate some of the floral botanical stuff, but they're also more loosely interpreted. Yolande and I both studied Japanese calligraphy for a number of years and don't apply it directly, but this kind of, I would call it a calligraphic line, speaks of the brushwork. Here's some more. It comes out in her work. Here you see probably copper leaf up here. And maybe the gold leaf here. It's getting quite expensive. The gold frames of 16th, 17th, 18th century artwork, and you see it in museums, were usually finished with gold leaf. Nowadays, there's other metals, cheaper ones. These paintings, same technique, but done more in monochrome. So they are black and white paintings with tiny little bits of color, which again goes back to the traditions in Asian art of minimal use of color. And here you can see the overlay. She might have glued very, very thin rice paper onto this. Sometimes she adheres different layers along with the metal leaf and painting on it. But they're exquisite pieces of art. And these again, yeah, her work is very distinct. Sometimes it's been a disadvantage for her. There were periods where there was a sense that the art, the technical stuff, well, I don't know. I don't get caught up in cross-cultural discussions. I find them very restrictive and I find them small-minded. The fact that she studied in Japan and uses a traditional technique and weaves and interweaves her own imagery and her own interpretation into it, for me, is totally legitimate. It has been held against her sometimes, particularly in certain situations of funding and this and that. But then once you get out of art and you get into commerce, it's a whole different discussion. Or you get out of art and you get into a sort of, I don't even know how to say it, particular cultural expression, then we're into a political discussion. But it is something to keep in mind. So Yolande has had both the advantage of being able to study a traditional technique and be very good at it, and at the same time has had some throwback, which isn't necessarily supportive. These are some of the later works. They're very tall, 10 feet, some of them. They're folded panels, as in traditional Asian artwork, still using the Nihonga with different techniques that she's added. But you can see here with the wall space and the floor, how big they are. And they're freestanding. They're very impressive. These, I think, were the largest that she did. And they probably were exhibited within the last 3 to 5 years. So we're cleansing the eyes again. And we're going to move on to Michael Merrill. And I want you to think about K.O. Bonnell's interior spaces, not to contrast and compare, but just to show two different visions. I'd asked Michael for the whole series of his art studios. He didn't have all of it on his computer, so I have a few. But he, again, Michael Merrill is, these are all artists of a certain age. I've known them many years. He was one of the few men who exhibited at Powerhouse, and he shared our communal studio space. He has been a consistent painter and teacher, so, like Kay, like Brian, like me. We have all taught in order to subsidize our painting careers. Yolande has done some teaching too. So Michael did a whole series of paintings on art studios, empty art studios, and he did them with minimal color. So very monochromatic, beautifully designed. He works from photographs and then reinterprets them later on. So that is a method he uses. And he's done a little bit of traveling. And the interesting quality of his work, I don't always like work that speaks too much of the photograph or the necessity to having to work from the photograph, is that he brings a flatter, distinct interpretation into it. So even though it probably has a photographically based feel to it, it is personal in his interpretation. Michael works in oil and in acrylic. These ones probably are acrylic. The earlier, his older stuff, which I'm going to try and get a beautiful still lifes painted in a more expressive way in oil. So I'm going to try and collect a bit more of his images. He's done a number of series of paintings of exhibition spaces. So we're just going to go through some of these. And here we have a very specific texture. I think you can see it, very sort of granular texture in this one, that may refer to photography, which is what it is. This was an exhibition, and these were photographic devices or shooting slides and things on the wall. You get a feel for the flatness, and that adds a quality. I don't know why, it's a bit reminiscent to me of sort of different way of using photography in the work and of Colville, a little bit Alexander Colville. The references are always there. It doesn't matter whose art you look at. I was trying to find a quotation, which I have since lost, but I will look for it again. It's a quotation by a painter who talks about never being alone in his studio. He's always accompanied by hundreds of painters that he's learned from in the past. So this is another one of Michael's works. I'm not sure, I don't know where it is. It might be in St. Henry. I'm not sure if that's the bridge
Yeah.
that crosses. Is it, does it look like
I
the
think it's
canal?
going into Verdun, I think. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it. Again, very flattened out, but beautiful design. He designs his work very well. This one is.
Was that John Berger who you're remembering spoke about being accompanied in the studio? Because I know he said something like that about,
Maybe.
yeah.
I will find it. It's somewhere on my collection of quotations. And it's partly in my head, so it's very frustrating that I can't find it, but I will keep looking. There's a lot of quotations of interest of how artists are always stepping on the shoulders of the artists who came before them, which provokes another discussion, which again, we won't have time for this evening, and that is what is original, what is unique. An important discussion and an interesting one. Here's another one that I rather like because he controls the color, the shapes and the movement and the structure really have a chance to make a strong statement. The one on the right here is one of the more photographic ones of his work. I tend to like emotion in art. I like feeling to come through. So I struggle a little bit with a sort of a higher realism, but I appreciate and can appreciate it, and can also appreciate that he is able to instill something personal in imagery that might be too closely related to photography in the hands of other painters. And certainly his choice of the bit of the world that he photographs is strong, and it shows a good sense of design and composition.
And your
Again,
juxtaposition is very interesting, the two of them together.
these two, the previous two.
The two we just looked at. The
Now,
staircase.
see if I
and
can
then
go
the
backwards. Here we go. Yes, yes, it is.
It's an interesting juxtaposition. It's very interesting.
It's, you know, what we put together and how we combine art and how we present it tells a story that may or may not be accurate. It's hard to tell. I select from the images. Here, again, two interiors. These ones feel, again, very photographic. And they're painted quite flatly. I'm used to him, in his oil paintings, he uses the squishy, juicy, expressive mark making of oil and brush. So these later works, which are more recent, I believe, are a whole different approach. But positive and positively, he is experimenting, and his work has evolved and changed in different ways. 10 people would argue 10 different ways about the progression of an artist's work, whether it gets stronger or weaker. Maybe they like something from the past and don't like the later stuff, but that really is just taught. These, again, won't appeal to everybody. They may appeal to everybody. They have a certain quality to them. You can see if you look closely, particularly here in the floor with the reflections, what a seductive subject this is for a painter. Because reflection, whether it's in water, I'm thinking of Monet's water lilies, or whether it's in the ceiling, a glossy ceiling that shows reflections, it calls the eye. So like it or not, it has it's interesting. I appreciate his steady painting over many years. So we're going to cleanse the eyes again, looking into black. And we're going to move on to Susan Lee. And Susan lives in the Laurentians. She's an artist I met, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago on the Route des Arts. We were both part of an open studio tour. And I was immediately impressed with her as a visual artist. And I think she's one of the better artists that I saw in the Laurentians. She stopped working, you know, Brian stopped teaching, he produces less work. Kay is still producing a bit of work. Susan stopped. You know, you get to a certain age and you run out of steam. And one can't have illusions in the visual arts because you're often working in isolation. You're frequently fortunate enough to have a group of people who support you in your work, but it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of determination and stubbornness to keep working. So I was very sad when Susan stopped working. And I'm happy to be able to show you these paintings leading up to one of her primary exhibition that she had in Saint-Jérôme. So she's a wonderful draftswoman. She has the sensitivity of touch that we saw so far in the other artists here, and simplicity of subject matter, playing with 3-dimension and 2-dimension, and these beautiful patterns of aquatic creatures. She has many different ways of expressing her work, and I've seen different series of her art, but these particular studies of birds and of aquatic life really struck me as beautiful. She's using very simple drawing and painting materials, ink, charcoal, watercolor, pastel. Very simplified studies. This particular study, I don't have the example with me. I do have it on a slide somewhere of a painting by John Ruskin painted in, I don't know, 1800 and something. It has a very similar feel to this. So there's the feeling of the traditional craftsmanship that evolved over hundreds of years, but the presentation is contemporary. So these are works that are all leading up. This is one more. This is a study. I think it says rocks with mold, charcoal, and soft pastel. A very modest subject matter, but beautifully and sensitively rendered by Susan. Now,
I think it says gourds.
is it gourds? Thank you. Not rocks, gourds. I wrote this. I went to her show in Saint-Jérôme, which was under-visited, sadly. Many exhibitions. There are people there at the opening, and then it's empty for the duration or very few visitors. But I wrote a critique of her work, which I'm going to reprint on my website in what month are we? In the April blog. And this is just a little sentence that I took from it. This refers specifically to the exhibition that she put on about 10 to 12 years ago. And she lives in the country near Lac Saint-Louis. The property she lives on borders on the water. And the exhibition had to do with the invisible, basically. The little organisms, the microscopic organisms and others that live under the water and in the water. And she made handmade paper and then worked on it. You can see she's got some writing, she's got drawing, different textures, painting. And on these handmade pieces of paper, she has overlaid other pieces of paper, painting and drawing. You can feel in her work, in Kay's work, in Yolande's work, the subtlety of the layering, and in Michael's painting and in Brian's sketching. There's a subtlety, a refinement to the way they work. He has an Asian influence in these as well. It was a beautiful show. Sadly, it wasn't in the main gallery at the museum. It was in the anteroom, which is red brick. I don't want to be a whiner, but if I were in a museum in charge of the walls, I would paint the red bricks, because you can just imagine the darker colors here, how strongly they would be influenced by a red brick wall. And I felt at the time the texture of the wall and the color kind of diminished it, which was a pity. But the work held up. Here's some others. The chair is a recurring image for her. It's interesting. One could probably look at art history for hundreds of years and just go back to the interpretation of chairs. We saw one in Brian's work at the beginning, and I mean, you go back, you'll see many, many, many chairs are represented in art. This was the biggest piece, and I think it was about 6 or 7 feet wide, maybe 3 feet, 3.5 feet high. And it was made up of these panels of her handmade paper and the feeling of the water and waves come through it beautifully. It was quite a lovely show. And I think that's it. I didn't want to make it too long this evening for the courageous who came out. But if you have any questions, or if you want to relook at an image, speak up now while I can still find the arrows, and I can go back. So perhaps anything you want to see again, anybody?
Well, I just wanted to mention that when you spoke of Brian's work, and
Yes.
he had done a painting with his influences, and we saw 2 women in the painting with him.
Yes.
I thought the one on the right was you.
The one he did with me
Isn't that you?
Yeah, it's not here. This was his mother. He was a illustrator, a fashion illustrator for magazine in Ontario. And this is Victoria Cowan, his partner. So
Oh.
these are 2 muses. I'm in a different one.
Like you.
Yeah. So I'll just very quickly go through some of the, whoops, oh, I moved that. I'm supposed to lock these things, I believe, so they don't move around. But just to refresh the looking. I hope you enjoyed these artists. They're people that I've enjoyed working with, enjoyed looking at their work. And I decided to keep collecting imagery and maybe put together a few more of these presentations. They're underrepresented, all of them. There are many, many artists today. There's few opportunities and fewer to exhibit work in the contexts that they need. It's
I have a
just,
question about Kay's space, the sort of factory-like space she was working with. Was that the complex in Saint-Henri?
I'm not sure. It could have been. It could have been there. Basically, it was an empty space. She was, somebody loaned her use of the studio.
Okay.
And she then was, I guess, going into the empty spaces and then going back to the studio to work. And produce art on a dining room table. It doesn't stop her. She just is able to work.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
And Yolande's work is so beautiful. Oh, gosh.
Her work is, I mean, I'm thinking of the years and the effort. When I met her, she was on welfare, raising her two girls. And because she came from a small town in the Beauce, she was able to get support from the local Caisse Populaire and the grocery owners, and people helped her. And that was how she managed to get her first flight to Tokyo. And she worked the Grey Nuns. She had a friend, a nun who had been working in the Beauce, was a nun in the Beauce, who went to a convent in Tokyo, and they put her up. She taught French and washed dishes, and that's how she subsidized her first trip. And then she, the professor that she studied with, helped her a little bit, and she, I think it was four times that she was able to get herself to Japan, which was quite a feat for someone who basically had no means. Just
I
the
would love
desire.
that screen right now so that I look out the window. I'd put it in front of my window so I wouldn't see the snow.
Yes. I guess winter's long for you, right?
Yes, I find it long at this time of year.
Yeah, I
Those
think we're all
pulsing
all
reds.
hoping, we're all hoping for spring. So
Yeah.
anyhow, and I'm going to try and get more of Susan's work. She's just such an exquisite.
Can we look at that last piece of Susan's again with the water, the wave? Yeah, that last one.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there.
yes, yeah. And the, you know, breaking up and piecing together the surface. I think that worked well here in this one. Sometimes we see things that become devices that seem artificial. But in this case, I kind of I understand what she was piecing together, and it works beautifully. Well, thank you. I appreciate the valuable time that you have put in, many of you who've come back for 4 weeks. And Elizabeth, who put this together at the Arundel Legion, especially Elizabeth, who did it all since COVID, when we were all stuck at home. And it inspired me to work on the computer more. So now I can do these presentations. Thanks, Elizabeth.
We thank you.
You've trained a dinosaur. And I'm hoping anyhow, maybe to do something here in the autumn, maybe something live. I've been thinking about it. I'll see. Not a drawing class, not a painting class, but maybe some experiences in observation. Gary, you can join us. That would be fun.
Will do.
Okay, something that might appeal to people who don't practice art, but might find some, I've got all kinds of stuff that might be interesting. So I'm going to give that some thought while I'm in Newfoundland and away from here. So I'd like to wish you a good night, all of you.
Okay,
And,
could you remove the screen share so we could see you to say goodnight?
I'm not.
Or maybe- I don't know if that's possible.
Did I lose the Zoom? Quite
There
possibly.
we go.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's
there's
Claire.
Claire. And
Hey, Claire.
Shiva's back. Hi, Shiva. Nice to see you. So I'm seeing faces
Winning.
below. Yes, all kinds of, Elizabeth is there and Sharon. People come on quietly and leave quietly. It's great. Well, thank you.
Joanna, I find it so poignant to see this work by this, just a few artists, but work that we don't get to see very often. And just thank you so much for putting it together and for archiving this work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
It's been
I
great.
think it's wonderful.
Good. I'm glad you enjoy it, and I want to keep at it. Most of the artists I know have to document their work. I mentioned it used to cost a fortune to take 35mm slides of quality and going and getting them developed and getting copies made and sending them out for submissions. Everybody used to do that. Now, even I, who I'm not a photographer, I can take the iPhone and snap pictures that are actually acceptable. So I'm going to keep it up and ask different artists that I know, or maybe you can recommend some. You can all email me. And I would like to get together some more of these lineups of diverse work that should be seen. Really, the opportunities are, it's hard. There are many artists. There are many layers of exposure, politics, blah, 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 that one has to go through. But I'm glad you enjoy it. I enjoy putting it together and I'm going to keep doing it. So
Great.
take care of yourselves,
Excellent.
all of you.
Have a wonderful
Nice
You too. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoy
Bye,
Newfoundland.
Joanna.
Oh, yeah.
Be safe on the road, have fun.
To enjoy everything. So
Good night.
take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Wonderful trips. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
If you have questions, just contact me, okay? Telephone, email, usual forms of communication. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.